There is a palace in England that should not exist. Blenheim stands across 11,000 acres of Oxfordshire countryside, its golden stone rising from parkland designed by Capability Brown, built to commemorate a military victory at a place most Englishmen could not locate on a map. The main house contains 187 rooms. The entrance hall soars 67 feet to a painted ceiling depicting the first Duke of Marlborough trampling his enemies beneath allegorical horses. It cost more than a modern battleship to maintain, even before the agricultural depression destroyed the rents that funded everything. By 1890, the 9th Duke of Marlborough was 23 years old, deeply in debt, and searching desperately for a solution that would not require him to work for a living. He found one. Her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt, and she brought with her $2.5 million in railroad stock. This is the story of the Gilded Age heiresses who crossed the Atlantic to marry European aristocrats. Not the sanitized romance you find in costume dramas, but the economic transaction beneath the satin and champagne. The women who became commodities in a market where titles were for sale and American fortunes bought what centuries of breeding could not: survival. Between 1870 and 1914, more than 400 American women married into the British aristocracy alone. They carried dowries totaling over $1 billion. That figure, adjusted for inflation, exceeds $20 billion today. The money rebuilt crumbling estates, paid off gambling debts, funded political careers, and purchased a respectability that the newly rich of America could never achieve at home. The women themselves got titles, position, and entry into a world where birth had always mattered more than wealth. Some found happiness. Many found misery. A few found power beyond anything their mothers could have imagined. One became the first woman to sit in Parliament. Another raised a future prime minister. A third ruled India as vicereine. Their blood now runs through the British royal family. Prince William, who will one day be king, carries the genes of American stockbrokers and department store magnates who would have been barred from Mrs. Astor's ballroom. The transaction reshaped two nations. American money saved the British aristocracy from extinction. British titles gave American families the social legitimacy they craved. And the women caught between these forces learned to navigate a world where they were simultaneously the most valuable commodity and the least powerful player at the table. This is their complete story: the money, the marriages, the suffering, the triumphs, and the legacy that endures long after the fortunes vanished and the estates became museums. If you value investigations into the invisible economic forces that shaped history, the women who were bought and sold like property, and the structures of power that determined who could rise and who would fall, please like this video and subscribe. Your support makes these deep explorations possible. Now, let us begin with the crisis that created a market for American brides. 1. The agricultural catastrophe that broke the aristocracy. For 700 years, the British landed aristocracy had rested their power on a foundation that seemed eternal: land. They owned it. Tenant farmers worked it. Rents flowed upward to fund country houses, London townhouses, political careers, and the elaborate machinery of upper-class life. The system had survived civil wars, revolutions, and the rise of industrial capitalism. Between 1809 and 1879, 88% of British millionaires were landowners. Aristocrats did not work. They did not need to. Their estates generated income that had sustained their families for generations. The land provided. Then the prairies opened. In the 1870s, American farmers began cultivating virgin soil across Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakota territories. Millions of acres that had never seen a plow suddenly produced wheat, corn, and grain in quantities that British farmers could not match. Labor was cheaper. Land was cheaper. Transportation costs fell as railroad networks expanded across the continent. At precisely the same moment, steamship technology transformed Atlantic shipping. Grain that once rotted in American ports could now reach Liverpool in 2 weeks. Refrigerated cargo holds brought beef from Argentina and lamb from New Zealand. Every ship that arrived drove prices lower. Between 1870 and 1900, the price of wheat fell by more than half. British agriculture entered a depression that would not end until the Second World War. The numbers were catastrophic. By the 1880s, Britain imported 45% of its grain. For corn, specifically, that figure reached 65%. Sheep farming collapsed as frozen mutton arrived from Australia. Cattle ranching withered under competition from South America. Tenant farmers who could not pay rent abandoned their leases. Fields that had been cultivated for centuries returned to weeds. Agricultural laborers fled to cities, seeking factory work that at least paid wages. And the aristocrats who depended on agricultural rents watched their incomes evaporate. An estate that had generated £20,000 annually in 1870 might produce £8,000 by 1890. The land had not changed. The world around it had. The mathematics were brutal. Consider what it cost to operate a country house of any significance. Longleat, one of the great estates of England, employed 43 indoor servants in 1890. A house steward, butler, under-butler, groom of chambers, valet, 3 footmen, a steward's room footman, 2 odd men, 2 pantry boys, a lamp boy, a housekeeper, 2 ladies' maids, a nurse, a nursery maid, 8 housemaids, 2 sewing maids, 2 still-room maids, 6 laundry maids, a chef, 2 kitchen maids, a vegetable maid, a scullery maid, and a daily woman. That list covered only the house. Add coachmen, grooms, stable boys, gardeners, and gamekeepers, and the wage bill consumed thousands of pounds every year. Wages were rising as industrial employment offered alternatives to domestic service. Workers could afford to demand better pay. Then came maintenance. These houses had been built across centuries, often without coherent plans. Wings were added when an heir married. Towers commemorated military victories. Entire floors existed because a visiting monarch needed accommodation. Heating such structures required tons of coal delivered by the wagon load. Roofs leaked constantly. Stone walls crumbled. Lead plumbing corroded. Electrical wiring, when it was installed at all, needed constant repair. Gardens demanded armies of workers to maintain the parterres, topiary, and forcing houses that aristocratic guests expected. And aristocratic hospitality itself consumed fortunes. House parties lasted for days or weeks. Guests arrived with their own servants, horses, and mountains of luggage. Shooting parties required beaters, loaders, and enough game to ensure visitors could slaughter hundreds of pheasants in an afternoon. Dinners involved multiple courses, each requiring specialized preparation. A single weekend could cost what a clerk earned in a year. The aristocracy had 3 options. They could adapt, investing in urban property, railways, mines, or other ventures that might produce income. Some did. The Duke of Westminster owned vast stretches of Mayfair and Belgravia in London, property that appreciated wildly as the city expanded. The Marquis of Bute invested in Welsh coal mines and Cardiff docks, becoming one of the richest men in Britain. But adaptation required entrepreneurial instincts that centuries of breeding had carefully eliminated. Aristocrats did not pursue profit. Commerce was vulgar. Trade was beneath them. Their entire identity rested on the assumption that they need, not work because their land provided for them. When the land stopped providing, They had no skills to replace that income. The second option was economizing. Close unused wings, dismiss servants, sell paintings or furniture to raise capital, cancel the London season. A few took this path, retreating into genteel poverty while maintaining the fiction of aristocratic life. Their houses decayed slowly, roofs patched with tarps, gardens reverting to wilderness. The family silver sold piece by piece to pay for coal. The third option was marriage. British manufacturing families had produced fortunes during the Industrial Revolution. Their daughters carried substantial dowries. Marrying brewery heiresses or steel magnates' daughters had become common by the 1870s. These marriages worked because both parties understood the transaction. Manufacturing families bought entry into aristocratic society. Aristocrats acquired money without the embarrassment of earning it. But British manufacturing, fortunes, substantial as they were, could not match the scale of American wealth. Across the Atlantic, the Civil War and westward expansion had created a new class of millionaires who made British industrialists look modest. Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, worth $100 million. Adjusted for inflation, that equals approximately $3 billion today. His fortune came from railroads and shipping. John D. Rockefeller built Standard Oil into a monopoly worth $300 million by 1890, equivalent to roughly $9 billion today. Andrew Carnegie sold his steel company in 1901 for $480 million, over $14 billion in modern terms. These fortunes dwarfed anything in Britain. The wealthiest British aristocrat, the Duke of Westminster, owned property worth perhaps £15 million, equal to $75 million. Substantial, but a fraction of what the American robber barons possessed. These new American millionaires had a problem. Despite their wealth, they remained outsiders in the society that mattered to them. Old New York guarded its drawing rooms jealously. The families who had ruled Manhattan since Dutch colonial days, the Livingstons, the Van Rensselaers, the Schermerhorns, regarded railroad and oil fortunes with contempt. Mrs. William Backhouse Astor, who controlled New York society through the sheer force of her will, maintained a list of exactly 400 families worthy of invitations to her balls. The number derived from the capacity of her ballroom. Anyone not on that list did not exist socially. New money might build mansions larger than the Astor House. They might own yachts, jewels, and art collections. None of it mattered. Without acceptance from the established families, they remained vulgar newcomers. For ambitious mothers watching their daughters grow up excluded from the best parties, Europe offered a solution. A British title carried weight that no American fortune could replicate. A duchess outranked every hostess in Manhattan. The daughter of a railroad baron might be snubbed by Mrs. Astor, but if that same daughter married a duke, Mrs. Astor would be forced to receive her. A title transformed a girl from a nobody into someone who could not be ignored. It was social alchemy, and the formula was simple. American fathers would provide dowries large enough to rescue drowning estates. British aristocrats would provide titles, ancient pedigrees, and entry into a society where birth still mattered more than money. Both sides got what they wanted. The transaction was efficient, rational, and profitable for everyone except, perhaps, the women who were sold. 2. The pioneer who proved it could be done. Consuelo Iznaga del Valle was not supposed to conquer London. She was born in Louisiana in 1853, the daughter of Don Antonio Iznaga del Valle, a Cuban-Spanish plantation owner whose wealth came from sugar and cotton. Her mother was an American woman from a respectable Louisiana family. The Iznagas were rich, cultured, and spoke multiple languages. They divided their time between Ravenswood Plantation and New York City. In the rigid hierarchy of Gilded Age society, they were also outsiders. New York's old Knickerbocker families did not welcome Cuban merchants, regardless of their wealth. The Iznagas were Catholics. They had accents. Their money smelled of trade. Mrs. Astor's famous 400 did not include them. The doors to the finest ballrooms remained closed. For ambitious families like the Iznagas, there was only one solution: look elsewhere. In the summer of 1875, at Saratoga Springs, the fashionable resort where wealthy New Yorkers escaped the city heat, Consuelo Iznaga encountered George Victor Drogo Montagu, Viscount Mandeville. He was 23 years old, heir to the Duke of Manchester, and recovering from typhoid fever that had left him weak and somewhat desperate. He also possessed a well-established reputation for gambling, drinking, and spending money he did not have. His father, the Duke, was already alarmed by the debts his son had accumulated. None of that mattered to the young woman who found herself captivated by his charm, his title, and the fantasy of escape from New York's closed doors. The courtship was rapid. Within months, they were engaged. The Duke of Manchester dispatched a trusted friend to prevent the marriage. He failed. On May 22, 1876, Consuelo Iznaga married Viscount Mandeville at Grace Church in Manhattan. The ceremony attracted significant press coverage. This was only the second marriage of an American woman to a British peer. The first, in 1874, had been Jenny Jerome's wedding to Lord Randolph Churchill, but the Churchills had kept that ceremony quiet, almost secretive. The Iznaga wedding was public, celebrated, and symbolically important. It announced that American money could purchase British titles. Her dowry reportedly amounted to £200,000, equivalent to roughly $25 million today. The sum flowed directly into the Mandeville family coffers, and from there into the gambling dens and racetracks that consumed George's life. Consuelo sailed for England to meet her new in-laws, who received her with barely concealed horror. The British upper classes had every reason to worry about these American invaders. They threatened to monopolize eligible young men, buying with crude dollars what British families had spent generations cultivating through careful breeding and alliances. The money was necessary. The women themselves were not. They were considered vulgar, ostentatious, and ignorant of the unwritten rules that governed aristocratic life. They dressed too elaborately. They spoke too loudly. They laughed at inappropriate moments. They treated servants with a familiarity that suggested they did not understand class hierarchies. One British matron complained that American women acted as though everyone were equal, a fantasy that no properly educated person could entertain. Consuelo understood none of this. She also did not care. What she possessed was something the English aristocracy had rarely encountered: fearlessness. She was beautiful, yes, with dark hair, flashing eyes, and a figure that drew attention in any room. But her real weapon was personality. She was witty, irreverent, and utterly unbothered by the disapproval of people she had never met. She smoked cigars when smoking was considered unladylike. She played the banjo, an instrument associated with minstrel shows and vulgarity. She told risque stories that made dowagers gasp and young men laugh. She wore gowns cut lower and decorated more extravagantly than anything British women dared. She walked into drawing rooms as though she owned them, and because she treated everyone with the same easy confidence, dukes and footmen alike, she confused the entire system. The Prince of Wales noticed immediately. Albert Edward, the future, King Edward VII, was perpetually bored by proper English ladies with their careful manners and predictable conversation. He presided over the Marlborough house set, a circle of wealthy, fashionable people who gathered at his residence to gamble, gossip, and pursue extramarital affairs with a discretion that fooled nobody. Consuelo was exactly what he wanted. She was fun. She was unpredictable. She treated royalty with the same casual irreverence she showed everyone else. Some accounts suggest their relationship became intimate. What is certain is that his public acceptance of her opened every door in England. Once the future king declared Consuelo acceptable, no hostess in the country could refuse her invitations. The irony was bitter. In New York, the Iznagas could not enter the best drawing rooms. In London, Consuelo dined with the heir to the throne. Her marriage, however, was a catastrophe from the beginning. Viscount Mandeville spent her dowry on gambling and his mistress with equal enthusiasm. His father, hoping to curb the young man's excesses, exiled the couple to Tandragee Castle in County Armagh, Ireland, a remote and isolated property far from the temptations of London. Consuelo hated every moment. Ireland in the 1870s was dangerous for English aristocrats. The land war was escalating. Tenants refused to pay rent. Secret societies targeted landlords for assassination. Consuelo, a Catholic from Louisiana, found herself trapped in a Protestant stronghold surrounded by people who despised everything she represented. Her husband disappeared for weeks at a time, pursuing his own pleasures in London or Dublin. She was 23 years old, alone in a foreign country, trapped in a marriage that had become a prison. When they finally returned to England, the pattern continued. Mandeville spent increasing amounts of time away from home. Consuelo navigated society alone, relying on a network of other American women who had made similar journeys. Chief among her friends was Jenny Jerome, Lady Randolph Churchill, who understood exactly what Consuelo was experiencing. They formed a mutual support system, introducing each other to useful people, sharing intelligence about which hostesses mattered and which could be ignored, and providing emotional support when their husbands proved useless. Consuelo also began cultivating friendships with men who could protect her socially. The Prince of Wales remained her most important ally. As long as he favored her, she was untouchable. Financial difficulties mounted throughout the 1880s. The Manchester estates generated almost no income. Mandeville's gambling consumed whatever money arrived. At one point, when the Prince of Wales announced he was coming to dinner, Consuelo had to ask friends to each bring a dish, because she could not afford to feed the notoriously gluttonous prince herself. The story became legend in London society. Here was a woman married to a future duke, entertaining the future king, and she could not afford dinner. The humiliation should have destroyed her. Instead, Consuelo converted it into opportunity. If she could not afford to live as a duchess, she would make money teaching others how to become one. Consuelo began offering her services to newly arrived American heiresses seeking titled husbands. For a fee, she provided etiquette lessons, explained the complex rules of precedence that governed who entered a room first, and made introductions to the right people. She taught them how to dress, how to address a duke versus an earl, which families mattered, and which could be safely ignored. She became, in effect, a paid consultant to the dollar princess invasion. Other established American women in London provided similar services, but Consuelo had an advantage. She was friends with the Prince of Wales. An introduction from her carried weight that no one else could match. She had conquered London society. Now she would help others do the same, and she would charge them handsomely for the privilege. By 1890, when Mandeville finally inherited the dukedom upon his father's death, Consuelo became the Duchess of Manchester. The title meant nothing to her emotionally. Her husband had long since ceased to matter. They rarely saw each other. He died 2 years later, in 1892, at 40 years old, leaving her a widow at 39 with 3 children and an estate drowning in debt. She never remarried. She never returned to obscurity. Consuelo remained a fixture of London society for another 17 years, a favorite of King Edward VII, who valued her friendship and her discretion. She entertained royalty, celebrities, and anyone interesting enough to amuse her. When her brother died in 1901, he left her $2 million, restoring her financial independence. At her death in 1909, she left an estate valued at nearly $2.5 million, along with jewelry that included a ruby and diamond bracelet she bequeathed to Queen Alexandra. The tiara she commissioned from Cartier in 1903, an elaborate confection of diamonds and pearls, now resides in the Victoria and Albert Museum. But her greatest legacy was not jewels or money. Consuelo Iznaga proved that an American woman could conquer the British aristocracy through sheer force of personality. She opened the door. Over the next 3 decades, hundreds of others would walk through it, many of them paying her for the privilege of learning how. The invasion had begun, and she had profited from it. 3. The Brooklyn girl who raised a prime minister. Leonard Jerome built better stables for his horses than most New Yorkers could afford for themselves. His mansion on Madison Avenue featured a private theater seating 600 guests, a breakfast room capable of accommodating 70, and fountains that could spray champagne during particularly extravagant parties. Wall Street called him the King of Wall Street, though the title changed hands frequently, depending on whose stocks were rising. Racing enthusiasts knew him as one of the founders of the American Jockey Club and the creator of Jerome Park Racetrack in the Bronx, a venue designed to bring European-style horse racing to America. He named his second daughter after the Swedish soprano Jenny Lind, who had taken America by storm decades earlier. The girl grew up called Jenny, and she would change the course of British history more profoundly than her father ever changed American horse racing. In 1867, when Jenny was 13, her mother Clara fled Leonard's serial infidelities and took the 3 Jerome sisters to Paris. They lived magnificently. Leonard sent money, always. Whatever his personal failings, he adored his daughters and ensured they wanted for nothing. They attended the best schools, wore the latest fashions, and moved through Parisian society with the ease that money purchased. When the Prussian army advanced on Paris in 1870, the Jeromes were among the last, foreign families to escape, relocating to London just before the siege began. There, in the drawing rooms of Mayfair and Belgravia, Jenny caught the attention of men who mattered. She was 19 years old, dark-haired, with what one admirer described as more of the panther than of the woman in her look. Her eyes were described by another observer as capable of flashing fire when she was angry or excited. She played piano exceptionally well. She had wit, beauty, and that peculiarly American quality that British men found intoxicating. She seemed unaware that anyone might be more important than she was. The Cowes Regatta in August 1873 was the social pinnacle of the British summer season. Held on the Isle of Wight, it drew the wealthiest families in England, who anchored their yachts in the harbor and competed in races that mattered more for prestige than prize money. On the night of August 12th, aboard HMS Ariadne, the Prince and Princess of Wales hosted a ball honoring Cesarevich Alexander, the heir to the Russian throne. Jenny attended wearing a white tulle gown that set off her dark coloring perfectly. Lord Randolph Churchill, the 24-year-old third son of the Duke of Marlborough, asked her to dance. By evening's end, he was smitten. 2 nights later, walking in a moonlit garden overlooking the harbor, he proposed. Jenny accepted without hesitation. They had known each other for 72 hours. Both families recoiled in horror. The Duke of Marlborough considered the Jeromes vulgar American speculators. Leonard Jerome, having recently lost another fortune in the Panic of 1873, initially supported the match, but withdrew his consent upon learning the depth of the Duke's contempt. The young couple endured months of separation, while their fathers haggled over money like horse traders negotiating a sale. The The Duke demanded proof that Leonard could actually provide the promised dowry. Leonard demanded assurances that his daughter would be treated with respect. Lawyers exchanged letters. Months passed. Eventually, a settlement was reached. Jerome agreed to settle £50,000 on the couple, with the innovative stipulation that half belonged to Jenny herself, rather than passing entirely to her husband's control. This was radical for the era. Under British law in 1874, married women had virtually no property rights. Everything a woman owned became her husband's property upon marriage. Jerome's lawyers structured the settlement to protect Jenny's interests, creating a trust that generated income for her personally. It was one of the earliest examples of what would become common practice in dollar princess marriages. The wedding took place on April 15, 1874, at the British Embassy in Paris. Neither of Randolph's parents attended. His brother Blandford represented the Marlborough family. Leonard gave away his daughter with a heavy heart. The ceremony was modest, almost secretive, with little coverage in the press. The Duke wanted no publicity for a match he considered humiliating. 7.5 months later, on November 30th, 1874, Jenny gave birth at Blenheim Palace. She had been staying with her in-laws, attempting to build a relationship with the Duchess, when she stumbled during a shooting party. The rough ride back to the palace in a pony carriage triggered labor. It began while a ball was underway elsewhere in the enormous house. Servants rushed Jenny to the nearest bedroom, which happened to be serving as a temporary cloakroom for guests' coats and cloaks. There, at 1:30 in the morning, surrounded by fur wraps and silk capes, she delivered a son. Lord Randolph wrote to his mother-in-law that the boy was wonderfully pretty, with dark hair and eyes, and remarkably healthy, considering his prematureness. They named him Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. Lord Randolph's political career rose with astonishing velocity. Elected to Parliament in 1874 as the member for Woodstock, constituency controlled by his father, he might have remained an undistinguished backbencher. Instead, he became a fierce parliamentary combatant, forming the Fourth Party with 3 other young conservatives who detested their own leadership's timid policies. They attacked the Liberal government with savage wit and rhetorical skill that made Randolph a celebrity. His phrase, "Tory democracy," captured imaginations across the country. He argued that conservatives must champion working-class interests or lose power forever. The establishment despised him. The public loved him. By 1886, at 37 years old, he stood at the pinnacle of British politics, Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the House of Commons. Prime Minister seemed inevitable. Then he destroyed everything. Frustrated by colleagues who refused to cut military spending, Randolph submitted his resignation to Prime Minister Lord Salisbury in December 1886, fully expecting that his popularity would force Salisbury to capitulate. Instead, Salisbury accepted immediately. Randolph learned his political career was finished when he read the announcement in the Times. He had gambled everything on a single gesture of defiance, and lost. He would later admit it was the greatest mistake of his life. The decade that followed was slow diminishment. Randolph's health deteriorated, his speech slurred, his gait became unsteady. Memory failed him. Doctors suspected syphilis, though modern scholars have proposed a brain tumor or other neurological disease as more likely. In 1894, desperately seeking recovery, he and Jenny embarked on a world tour. They traveled with a lid-lined coffin in their luggage, a grim acknowledgement of how the journey might end. By the time their ship docked back in England that December, Randolph could barely speak. He died on January 24, 1895, at 45 years old. Jenny was 40. Her husband had left debts instead of wealth. But she possessed something beyond money, a vast network of the most powerful men in Britain, and an absolute conviction that her elder son was destined for greatness. She became Winston's fiercest advocate, promoter, and protector. When he sought a military commission, she lobbied generals. When he wanted to become a war correspondent, she wrote to editors. When he stood for Parliament, she campaigned for him relentlessly, working constituencies that shocked upper-class observers. Women of her station did not knock on doors in working-class neighborhoods. Jenny did, because Winston needed votes. When the Boer War erupted in 1899, she chartered a hospital ship called the Maine, raised £150,000 to outfit it, and sailed to South Africa herself. Both her sons were serving there. Winston had already gained fame for his dramatic escape from Boer captivity, a story that made headlines across the empire. Her younger son Jack was wounded during the relief of Ladysmith and treated aboard her ship. Jenny nursed. Soldiers alongside the medical staff, treating British and Boer casualties alike, working shifts that exhausted women half her age. Her romantic life remained vigorous. In 1900, she married George Cornwallis West, a captain in the Scots Guards, who was 16 days older than Winston. Society was scandalized. The marriage lasted 14 years before ending in divorce when George left her for another woman. In 1918, at 64, she married Montague Porch, a civil servant in the Nigerian colonial administration who was 3 years younger than Winston. Her son reportedly quipped that she had provided him with a stepfather younger than himself. Jenny did not care what people thought. She never had. In May 1921, while visiting friends in Somerset, she wore a new pair of Italian high-heeled shoes she had purchased on a recent trip to Rome. The soles had not been properly scored to prevent slipping. Walking down a staircase, she fell, fracturing her ankle. Gangrene set in rapidly. Surgeons amputated her left leg above the knee on June 10th, attempting to stop the infection. She seemed to recover, joking with visitors and planning her return to London. Then, on June 29th, an artery in her thigh hemorrhaged. She bled to death before doctors could intervene. She was 67 years old. Winston later wrote that his mother had shone for me like the evening star. I loved her dearly, but at a distance. That distance was typical of upper-class British parenting in the Victorian era. Children were raised by nannies and governesses, seeing their parents briefly in the evening before bed. Yet Jenny gave Winston something more valuable than daily affection: unshakable belief in his destiny and the connections to pursue it. She introduced him to everyone who mattered. She promoted his books, his journalism, his political ambitions with a determination that bordered on ferocity. When he needed money, she found it. When he needed advice, she gave it. When he needed doors opened, she opened them. The Brooklyn girl who had danced at Cowes in 1873 had launched a dynasty that would shape the 20th century. She was buried beside Lord Randolph in the churchyard at Blaydon, near Blenheim Palace. Half a century later, her son would join them there. 4. The Alabama girl who conquered New York and sold her daughter. Alva Smith was 6 years old when the Civil War destroyed her family's fortune. Her father, Murray Forbes Smith, had been a prosperous cotton merchant in Mobile, Alabama, with connections throughout the South. By 1865, he was ruined. Confederate currency was worthless. His warehouses had burned. The economy that had sustained his business no longer existed. The Smiths fled to Paris, where living was cheap for Americans with even modest resources. Alva attended boarding school and learned to speak French like a native. She also learned something more valuable than language: how European aristocrats thought about power, lineage, and the uses of marriage. She watched French noblewomen navigate society with a ruthlessness that made Southern belles seem naive. She observed how strategic marriages consolidated fortunes and elevated families. She absorbed lessons that would serve her for the rest of her life. When the family returned to New York in the early 1870s, they had social connections but empty pockets. Alva's mother died in 1871, leaving the Smith daughters in a precarious position. Their father's finances never recovered from the war. The girls needed to marry well or face genteel poverty, teaching piano to other people's children, or serving as paid companions to wealthy widows. Alva was beautiful, yes, but beauty faded. She needed something more permanent. She needed to marry spectacularly, and she needed to do it before her father's remaining resources disappeared entirely. William Kissam Vanderbilt was the grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the ferryman's son who had built a railroad and shipping empire worth $100 million at his death in 1877. William, known as Willie, stood to inherit tens of millions. He was also handsome, amiable, interested in yachting and horses, and entirely manageable. His personality presented no obstacles. He liked Alva. She dazzled him. They married on April 20th, 1875, at Calvary Church in Manhattan. Alva was 22 years old and had just become one of the richest women in America. Money, however, bought nothing in old New York society. The families who had ruled the city for generations, the Astors, the Schermerhorns, the Livingstons, the Van Rensselaers, regarded the Vanderbilts as vulgar newcomers. Cornelius Vanderbilt had cursed like a sailor, spat tobacco, and built his fortune through methods that polite society considered barely legal. His money was too new, too raw, too obviously connected to actual work. Alva found doors closed despite her husband's millions. Mrs. William Backhouse Astor, who ruled New York society with absolute authority, did not receive her. Invitations did not arrive. Alva was rich, but she did not exist socially. She resolved to break down every door that had been closed to her. Her weapon was architecture. She hired Richard Morris Hunt, the most celebrated architect in America, to design a French Renaissance chateau at 665th Avenue on the northwest corner of 5th Avenue and 52nd Street. The mansion took 4 years to build and cost $3 million, equivalent to roughly $90 million today. Alva supervised construction personally, appearing on scaffolding to inspect stonework, reviewing blueprints with Hunt as though she were a trained architect herself. When critics suggested such involvement was unladylike, she ignored them. This was her project, her weapon, and she would oversee every detail. The house opened in March 1883 with a costume ball that cost $250,000. 1,200 guests attended. The newspapers devoted pages to descriptions of the decorations, the costumes designed by Charles Frederick Worth in Paris, the rivers of champagne, the dinner served at 2 a.m. Mrs. Astor herself appeared dressed as a Venetian Renaissance noblewoman. She had resisted attending, but her daughter Carrie had been desperate to join the Vanderbilt ball, which everyone knew would be the social event of the decade. When Alva quietly let it be known that she could not possibly invite Miss Carrie Astor because Mrs. Astor had never called on her, Mrs. Astor capitulated. She left her calling card at 665th Avenue. Alva had won. By morning, she had achieved what money alone could never accomplish. Society had been forced to acknowledge her. She spent the following decade consolidating power. In 1886, after Willie inherited $65 million from his father, William Henry Vanderbilt's estate, Alva commissioned the largest private yacht in the world. The Alva measured 285 feet, dwarfing even other vessels owned by families who had been yachting for generations. She sailed it through the Caribbean and Mediterranean, entertaining European aristocrats aboard. Then she turned to Newport, Rhode Island, the summer resort where America's wealthiest families maintained cottages that were actually palaces. Alva hired Hunt again to build Marble House, a mansion modeled directly on the Petit Trianon at Versailles. It cost $11 million, equivalent to roughly $330 million today. The construction consumed 50,000 cubic feet of marble. 36 servants staffed the property during the summer season. The ballroom could accommodate 300 guests. The house stood on Bellevue Avenue, next door to much simpler cottages owned by families who had once excluded her. She had triumphed completely. By 1895, Alva Vanderbilt had everything she had ever wanted except a faithful husband. Willie's infidelities had continued throughout their marriage, growing less discreet as the years passed. Alva had tolerated them while she needed his money and name to establish her position. Now she needed neither. In March 1895, she filed for divorce on grounds of adultery, naming Nellie Neustretter, the wife of a New York lawyer, as correspondent. Society recoiled in horror. Divorce was social suicide for women of her class. Cast-off wives disappeared into obscurity, their reputations destroyed, their children taken from them, their names never mentioned again in polite company. Alva calculated differently. She extracted a settlement exceeding $10 million in cash and securities, plus Marble House and other properties outright. She retained custody of her 3 children. Most remarkably, she retained the right to remarry, a privilege courts rarely granted to divorced women. The scandal was enormous. Former friends cut her on the street. Invitations stopped arriving. Hostesses who had competed for her presence now refused to acknowledge her existence. Alva had gambled her entire position on a single conviction, that she could rebuild from nothing, just as she had done 20 years earlier as a penniless girl from Alabama. But this time, she would not rebuild alone. She had a daughter. Consuelo Vanderbilt was 18 in 1895, a celebrated beauty who had been groomed since childhood for a magnificent marriage. Alva had supervised every element of her education: languages, music, deportment, painting, the arts of conversation and entertainment that a great hostess required. The girl had been shaped like a piece of fine porcelain, crafted specifically to ornament the highest levels of society. Consuelo was tall, slender, with a long neck and delicate features that photographers loved. She had been trained to sit with perfect posture, achieved through years of wearing a steel brace that Alva strapped to her spine during lessons. She had been trained to walk, to speak, to enter a room, to manage servants, to organize dinner, parties. She was 18 years old and had never made a meaningful decision in her life. Now that New York society had rejected Alva, her daughter's marriage became more than ambition. It became necessity. A brilliant match would prove that the divorce had not diminished the Vanderbilts. It would force the families who had abandoned Alva to acknowledge her once again. And if that match involved a title, a real title from the oldest aristocracy in Europe, it would place Alva beyond the reach of any American snob forever. She identified her target with the precision of a general planning a campaign. Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, was 24 years old, master of Blenheim Palace, heir to one of the greatest names in British history, and virtually bankrupt. The agricultural depression had destroyed the income from his estates. Death duties imposed when his father died had stripped away capital. He needed American money, or he needed to sell Blenheim. Those were his choices. Alva needed British legitimacy. She began making arrangements. Her daughter's preferences were irrelevant. 5. The bride who wept Winthrop Rutherford was everything Alva despised. He was handsome, with the kind of aristocratic features that suggested generations of good breeding. He was charming, with manners polished at the best schools. He was well-born, descended from Peter Stuyvesant and John Winthrop, names that meant something in old New York. He moved through society with the ease of someone who had never been excluded from anything. Edith Wharton would later model the romantic heroes in her novels after him. He was also American. He could never make Consuelo a duchess. He could never restore Alva's position. He could never force Mrs. Astor to bow. For these reasons, he was completely unacceptable. Consuelo did not care about titles. She was 18 years old and in love for the first time in her life. They met at parties, at dances, during the endless social rounds that consumed every season in New York. Winthrop was 33, 15 years her senior, but the age difference seemed irrelevant when they talked. He listened to her. He asked her opinions about books, art, music, politics. No one had ever asked Consuelo's opinion about anything. Her mother had made that clear years earlier when teenage Consuelo objected to a dress Alva had selected. "I do the thinking," Alva had informed her. "You do as you're told." In the spring of 1895, the young couple joined a group of friends for a bicycle excursion along Riverside Drive. When the others pulled ahead, Winthrop slowed his pace. They were alone for perhaps 5 minutes. He proposed. Consuelo accepted without hesitation. They agreed to keep the engagement secret until they could find a way to escape Alva's control. Perhaps they would elope. Perhaps they would simply announce the engagement publicly, presenting Alva with a situation she could not undo. The next morning, Consuelo departed for Europe with Alva. The trip had been planned for months. They would visit Paris, London, and various European resorts, ostensibly so Consuelo could experience continental culture. The actual purpose was to parade her before titled aristocrats. Winthrop promised to follow. He would find her in Paris. They would plan their elopement there, away from Alva's surveillance. Consuelo crossed the Atlantic believing freedom was only weeks away. She underestimated her mother completely. Alva had not spent 20 years fighting her way to the top of New York society to let her daughter throw away everything on an American, title or no title. She understood what Consuelo did not: that love was a temporary emotion, while position lasted forever. She would save her daughter from herself. When Winthrop Rutherford arrived in Paris and presented himself at the Isnagas Hotel where Alva and Consuelo were staying, Alva refused to admit him. Hotel staff turned him away with the explanation that Madame Vanderbilt was not receiving visitors. He sent letters. Alva intercepted them before they reached Consuelo's hands. He sent telegrams. Alva destroyed them. She moved Consuelo from city to city, always staying one step ahead of the man pursuing them. She invented slanders. Rutherford came from a family prone to madness, she told Consuelo. His grandfather had died in an asylum. He himself showed signs of instability. He could not father children, she announced without evidence. He wanted only the Vanderbilt fortune, she insisted, as though that accusation carried weight coming from a woman arranging to sell her daughter to a duke. In London, Alva engineered the introduction that would determine Consuelo's fate. Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, was 24 years old and desperate. Blenheim Palace was costing him approximately $100,000 annually just to maintain. His estates generated perhaps $60,000. The Heiresses mathematics were simple. Without an infusion of capital, he would have to sell Blenheim within a decade, becoming the duke who lost the family seat. Or he could marry an American heiress. Alva made herself available. She possessed $10 million from her divorce settlement, Marble House, and a daughter who would bring one of the largest dowries in history. The Duke needed what she had. She needed what he had. They began negotiations. Consuelo felt nothing for the Duke. She would later describe him as cold, formal, and without intellectual qualities that interested her. He was short, barely taller than she was, with a pinched face and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything in terms of cost. He dressed impeccably, He spoke in clipped sentences. He seemed incapable of humor or warmth. But Alva had not spent 18 years molding her daughter to accept refusal now. When Consuelo was a child, Alva had strapped a steel brace to her spine during daily lessons, forcing perfect posture for hours at a time. She had used a riding crop for discipline. She had controlled every aspect of the girl's education, clothing, friendships, and activities. The daughter who emerged from that upbringing knew how to endure. She did not know how to resist. Still, she tried once. Back in Newport that August, with the Duke installed as a guest at Marble House, Consuelo confronted her mother in her bedroom. She announced her intention to refuse the Duke's proposal, which everyone knew was coming. She declared her love for Winthrop Rutherford. She said she would marry him or no one. These words, she later wrote in her memoir, were the bravest she had ever spoken. Alva exploded. She called Rutherford a fortune hunter. She threatened to shoot any man who tried to ruin her daughter's life by marrying her without permission. She screamed that Consuelo was an ungrateful child who understood nothing about what Alva had sacrificed to give her this opportunity. The argument raged for hours, through the afternoon and into the evening. When Consuelo still refused to yield, Alva collapsed onto her bed, clutching her chest, gasping that her heart was failing. Servants were summoned. A doctor arrived. Consuelo was ordered from the room. The next morning, a family friend delivered devastating news. Alva had suffered a heart attack during the night. Her condition was grave. The doctor said another shock might kill her. Consuelo could save her mother's life by agreeing to marry the Duke. The choice was presented as binary: Consuelo's happiness or her mother's life. Consuelo was 18 years old. She broke. She sent word to Winthrop Rutherford that she could not marry him. Within days, Alva made a miraculous recovery. The heart attack, if it had ever been real, disappeared without trace. The Duke proposed formally in the Gothic room at Marble House. Consuelo accepted because she no longer had the strength to do otherwise. Alva immediately began planning the wedding of the decade. The ceremony took place on November 6, 1895, at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue. Alva orchestrated publicity for weeks, feeding newspapers details about the gown: white satin with a 15-foot train embroidered with seed pearls, the jewels, the flowers sent from Blenheim's greenhouses, the titled guests sailing from England. On the morning of the wedding, Consuelo wept so violently that her face swelled and her eyes nearly closed. A footman stood guard outside her bedroom door, preventing anyone from entering or leaving. Inside the church, 300 policemen lined the streets. Thousands of spectators pressed against barricades, straining for a glimpse of America's most famous heiress. The bride arrived 20 minutes late. Those close enough to see beneath her veil noticed her face was red and swollen, her eyes nearly shut from crying. Alva walked beside her, gripping her arm. Inside, the Duke waited at the altar. He had arrived late himself, reportedly because last-minute negotiations over the marriage settlement had extended into the morning. The final agreement granted him $2.5 million in Beech Creek Railway Company stock, guaranteed to produce at least $100,000 annually for life. Additionally, he received a cash payment of $100,000 immediately. Adjusted for inflation, the total exceeds $75 million today. It remains one of the largest marriage settlements in the history of Anglo-American unions. Consuelo walked toward him slowly, surrounded by 8 bridesmaids, including her cousin Gertrude Vanderbilt, watched by everyone who mattered in New York society. The ceremony proceeded according to Episcopal rites. Vows were exchanged. When it ended, Consuelo Vanderbilt no longer existed legally. In her place stood Her Grace, the Duchess of Marlborough. On their honeymoon, traveling through Europe by private rail car, The Duke clarified the nature of their arrangement. He had not married her for love, he told her. He had married her because he felt obliged to save Blenheim. She should expect nothing more from him than courtesy and an heir. She was 19 years old, and her life had just been sold for $3 million. 6. The palace bought with railroad stock. Blenheim Palace sits on 11,000 acres in Oxfordshire, 30 miles northwest of Oxford. It contains 187 rooms, the main block alone measuring 850 feet from end to end. The entrance hall soars 67 feet to a ceiling painted by Sir James Thornhill, depicting the first Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill, trampling enemies beneath the hooves of allegorical horses. The palace was built between 1705 and 1722 as a gift from a grateful nation to the general who had defeated Louis XIV's armies at Blenheim in 1704. Queen Anne granted him the royal manor of Woodstock and £17,000 annually from Parliament to construct a bay monument to British military power. The house that resulted was not designed for comfort. It was designed to overwhelm. Blenheim announced that Britain ruled Europe, that her generals were demigods, and that military glory would be rewarded with palaces that made aristocrats look like kings. By 1895, 2 centuries after the victory it commemorated, Blenheim had become a financial catastrophe. The house required 40 indoor servants just to maintain basic functions: housemaids, footmen, grooms of the chamber, kitchen staff, laundry maids. The grounds demanded armies of gardeners to maintain the parterres, woodlands, and kitchen gardens that sprawled across the estate. Water features required constant attention. Stone walls crumbled, lead roofs leaked. The house had no central heating, no running hot water in most bedrooms, and plumbing that dated to the previous century. Heating the main state rooms consumed tons of coal daily during winter. The annual operating cost exceeded $100,000. Estate income produced perhaps $60,000. The 9th Duke, Charles Spencer Churchill, had inherited this magnificent burden at age 21 in 1892, along with a dukedom that carried enormous prestige and almost no liquid capital. Consuelo arrived in November 1895 as the solution to all of these problems. Her first glimpse of Blenheim came from the railway station at Woodstock, where carriages met them. As they drove through the gates and up the long approach, she saw the north front of the palace rising from parkland designed by Capability Brown, the greatest landscape architect of the 18th century. Swans drifted on ornamental lakes. Ancient oaks framed views calculated to inspire awe. The house itself, golden stone glowing in late afternoon light, looked like something from a fairy tale. Then she walked inside and discovered it was freezing. November in an unheated palace felt like living in a stone tomb. Servants brought metal warming pans, filled with hot coals to take the chill off bedsheets. Dressing for dinner required standing as close to the fireplace as possible, while maids worked quickly to avoid frostbite. Bathwater was heated in the kitchen and carried upstairs by footmen. By the time it reached the bedroom, it was lukewarm. Consuelo's mother-in-law, Frances, the Dowager Duchess of Marlborough, made clear what was expected. Frances lived in a separate wing of the palace, but involved herself in every aspect of Consuelo's life. She interrogated her regularly about pregnancy. "Your first duty is to have a child," the old woman announced, "and it must be a son, because it would be intolerable to have that little upstart Winston become Duke." Winston Churchill was the Duke's cousin, grandson of the 7th Duke, and next in line if Charles died without a male heir. Frances detested him and his mother with equal passion. The idea that Winston might inherit Blenheim drove her to monitor Consuelo's health obsessively. Every month that passed without a pregnancy announcement brought fresh interrogation. The Duke himself proved as cold and formal in private as he had been in public. He maintained a rigorous schedule that left little room for his wife. He rose early, managed estate business with his agents, inspected work being done on tenant farms, and pursued his passion for astronomy in a private observatory he maintained on the roof. He spoke rarely at meals. When he did speak, it was usually to criticize. Consuelo's gowns were too elaborate, her conversation too frivolous, her friends too American. She did not understand proper precedence at dinner parties. She laughed too loudly. She treated servants with excessive familiarity. The criticisms were relentless and delivered in a tone that suggested he was training a dog. He made clear that she had one purpose: to produce an heir. Everything else about her was unsatisfactory. Consuelo learned to endure. She had been trained for endurance. What she had not been trained for was loneliness. Blenheim was isolated. The nearest town, Woodstock, was barely a village. Oxford offered some society, but the Duke discouraged trips. He preferred that she remain at Blenheim, available for his needs, and visible to the estate workers who needed to see that the Duchess was fulfilling her duties. Her only escape was Winston Churchill. Jenny's son visited Blenheim regularly, often bringing friends from London. He was 21 in 1895, recently graduated from Sandhurst, and about to embark on his military career. He talked constantly, argued passionately about politics and military strategy, and treated Consuelo as an intelligent equal. His mother had been American, too. Perhaps that explained why he understood her isolation. He included her in conversations, asked her opinions, and defended her when the Duke's relatives made snide remarks about American manners. Consuelo later described Winston as the life and soul of the young and brilliant circle that gathered at Blenheim when he was present. He was also genuinely fond of her, which was more than she could say about most of the people in her new life. In January 1897, Consuelo gave birth to a son, John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill, Marquess of Blandford, the required heir. In May 1898, she delivered a second son, Ivor Charles Spencer Churchill, the spare. She had fulfilled her obligation. She later described the births using a phrase that became famous: an heir and a spare. With her duties complete, the marriage deteriorated openly. The Duke pursued Gladys Deacon, an American beauty known for her striking looks and scandalous behavior. Consuelo sought her own consolations. Travel became her escape. Charity work among the estate's tenant farmers gave her purpose. She established reading rooms, organized medical clinics, and funded school improvements. The work was genuine. She cared about these families who lived in tied cottages with no security beyond the Duke's favor. In 1906, after a decade of mutual misery, they formally separated. Winston Churchill helped negotiate terms. Consuelo moved to London, retaining her title and an allowance, but freed from the obligation to live with a man who despised her. She was 29 years old. The marriage was over. Her life could finally begin. 7. The Chicago merchant's daughter who ruled India. Mary Victoria later grew up surrounded by money, but never by acceptance. Her father, Levi Ziegler Leiter, had arrived in America as the son of Swiss-German immigrants who settled in Maryland. He worked as a store clerk, saved relentlessly, and partnered with Potter Palmer to establish what would become Marshall Field and Company, eventually the greatest department store in Chicago. By 1881, when Levi sold his share to Marshall Field for $3 million, he was one of the wealthiest men in the city. By the time Mary was born, on May 27, 1870, the family fortune exceeded $10 million. They owned a mansion on Wisconsin's Lake Geneva, where they moored their steam yacht, Daisy. They socialized with Chicago's leading families. But old Chicago society, such as it was, never forgot that Levi Leiter had once stood behind a counter measuring fabric. In 1881, the family relocated to Washington, D.C. Levi purchased the former residence of James G. Blaine, the former Secretary of State and presidential candidate, a 55-room mansion on DuPont Circle that announced their arrival in the capital. Mary's mother became one of the city's leading hostesses, entertaining senators, cabinet members, and foreign diplomats. The young Mary, who would grow to 5 feet 8 inches, tall for a woman of that era, debuted into Washington society in 1888 and counted Frances Cleveland, the First Lady, among her closest friends. She was educated by private tutors in languages, music, and art. A Columbia University professor taught her history and chemistry. She passed through finishing school in England, perfecting her French, and acquiring the Polish that American heiresses needed to compete internationally. By 20, she was cultured, intelligent, fluent in French, and utterly lonely. Unlike Consuelo Vanderbilt, Mary later suffered no controlling mother. Unlike Jenny Jerome, she felt no burning passion to conquer society. She simply wanted to find someone worthy of her devotion. The young men of Washington and New York seemed frivolous to her. They talked about horses, parties, and sports, subjects that bored her profoundly. The titled Europeans who pursued American heiresses seemed interested only in her father's bank account. None of them saw her. None of them asked what she thought, what she wanted, what kind of life she imagined for herself. Then she walked into a London ballroom in 1890 and saw George Nathaniel Curzon. He was 31 years old, 11 years her senior. He served as Member of Parliament for Southport, a Lancashire constituency he had won in soars 1886. He was heir to the barony of Scarsdale, though the title carried almost no income. More importantly to Mary, he was brilliant. He had written acclaimed books on Persia and Central Asia. He spoke with authority about empires, borders, and the future of British power. He worked himself to exhaustion, pursuing political ambitions that seemed limitless. A childhood riding accident had damaged his spine, leaving him in constant pain and forcing him to wear a steel brace for the rest of his life. The brace gave him a rigid, formal posture that many found cold. Mary found it magnificent. On the day they met, she wrote to a friend, "I will have him because I believe he needs me. I have no shame." George was intrigued but wary. American heiresses were common in London by 1890. British aristocrats had learned to be cautious about matches that might benefit their estates but damage their reputations. He continued his travels, his political work, his endless ambitions. Mary waited. Other suitors presented themselves. She rejected them all. 3 years passed. In 1893, while visiting England again, Mary arranged to meet George and confessed everything. She told him it was him or no one. She had waited 3 years. She would wait longer if necessary, but she would not marry anyone else. His response was almost everything she hoped for. He admitted he felt the same way. But he feared what his father would say about an American daughter-in-law. He feared what society would whisper. He needed time. Mary gave him 2 more years. They were secretly engaged in 1893, but did not marry until April 22, 1895, at St. John's Episcopal Church on Lafayette Square in Washington. The Laters paid off George's considerable debts, approximately £40,000, and provided a dowry settlement of $200,000. Mary did not care about the money. She had found a man she considered worthy of absolute devotion. She gave him exactly that. When George campaigned for re-election to Parliament that autumn, observers credited his victory more to his wife's charm than to his own speeches. She spoke at rallies, a shocking breach of etiquette that British wives rarely attempted. She charmed voters in their homes, remembering names and details about their families. She poured tea and made conversation with laborers' wives as though they were duchesses. George won by a larger margin than anyone expected. When he worked late into the night on policy papers or parliamentary speeches, Mary sat nearby, reading or writing letters, ready to assist if he needed her. When his chronic back pain left him unable to move, she nursed him without complaint. She subordinated her own considerable intelligence entirely to his ambitions. In 1898, those ambitions reached their zenith. George Nathaniel Curzon was appointed Viceroy of India, the most powerful position in the British Empire outside London. The Viceroy ruled over 300 million people. He commanded armies, shaped policy, negotiated with Maharajas, and represented the crown in a land of ancient civilizations. At 39 years old, George had achieved what he had pursued since boyhood, and Mary, at 28, became the Viceroy of India, the highest political rank ever attained by an American woman. They sailed for Bombay in December 1898. Mary wrote to her mother that they were being treated like grandees. Station masters met them at every stop. Railway carriages were reserved exclusively for their party. Viceregal flags flew from every building they passed. But she had no idea what awaited her. Government House in Calcutta was a palace larger than Buckingham, modeled on Kedleston Hall, the Curzon family estate in Derbyshire. It was staffed by hundreds of servants in scarlet and gold livery. The Curzons entertained constantly, hosting dinners for 50, balls for hundreds, receptions for thousands. Protocol governed every moment. Who sat where at dinner depended on intricate rules of precedence that considered military rank, civil rank, length of service, and obscure distinctions between different branches of the Indian civil service. Mary learned to navigate these protocols with a precision that astonished British officials who had spent decades in India. She also discovered suffering on a scale Washington society had never shown her. India, in 1899, was emerging from a devastating famine that had killed millions. Entire districts had been depopulated. Survivors lived in conditions that shocked even hardened colonial administrators. Mary threw herself into charitable work. She championed female doctors at a time when Indian women often refused treatment from men. She established Victoria scholarships to train nurses and midwives. She visited hospitals, orphanages, and schools, often traveling to districts where no viceroy had ever ventured. A hospital in Bangalore would eventually bear her name, the Lady Curzon Hospital for Women and Children. The work exhausted her. India's climate was punishing. Summer temperatures in Calcutta exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The monsoon brought humidity that rotted fabric and leather overnight. Disease was endemic. Cholera, typhoid, malaria, and dysentery killed thousands annually. Even British officials with access to the best medical care died regularly. Mary, who had always been delicate, weakened steadily under the strain. In 1902, George organized the Delhi Durbar, a celebration of Edward VII's coronation as Emperor of India, designed to become the grandest pageant in the history of the British Empire. For Mary, it would be the pinnacle of her life as Viceroy, and very nearly her death. But that belongs to the next chapter. 8. The Peacock Dress and the Cost of Empire. The Delhi Durbar of January 1903 was designed to overwhelm. George Curzon had spent 2 years planning every detail of the celebration, marking Edward VII's coronation as Emperor of India. He wanted the world to witness British power at its most magnificent. He also wanted to demonstrate to the Indian princes that British rule was permanent, unshakable, and backed by military force that no Maharaja could match. Elephants draped in gold brocade and hung with howdahs encrusted with jewels processed through streets lined with troops from every regiment in India. Cavalry units from Australia, Canada, South Africa, and New Zealand demonstrated the empire's global reach. Maharajas arrived with retinues numbering in the hundreds, their turbans blazing with rubies, emeralds, and diamonds accumulated over centuries. A tent city covering 25 square miles housed the guests. The costs exceeded £1,000,000. The Times of London called it the grandest pageant in the history of the world. Mary understood her role perfectly. As vicereine, she would stand beside her husband at the center of this spectacle. Every eye would be upon her. Every detail of her appearance would be scrutinized by Indian princes, British aristocrats, and journalists from 3 continents. She needed a gown that announced American wealth and British imperial majesty simultaneously. She turned to the House of Worth in Paris, the most celebrated dressmaker in the world. But the design would be hers. The fabric came from India itself. Mary had fallen in love with the country's textiles during her years as vicereine. Indian weavers created cloth unlike anything produced in Europe. Silk so fine it could be pulled through a wedding ring, brocades heavy with gold thread, muslins that weighed almost nothing. For the Durbar gown, she commissioned gold cloth from the weavers of Delhi, the same craftsmen who created ceremonial robes for Maharajas. The cloth alone cost more than most British officials earned in a year. Onto this shimmering surface, Indian artisans embroidered peacock feathers using a technique called zardozi, stitching with gold and silver thread wrapped around silk. The work required months. Each feather was outlined in gold, the eye detailed in silver, the barbs rendered with such precision that they seemed to ripple when the fabric moved. The peacock was no accident. In Indian tradition, the peacock symbolized royalty, immortality, and divine power. The bird was sacred to Lakshmi, goddess of wealth and prosperity. By wearing peacock feathers, Mary aligned herself with Indian cultural traditions, even as she represented the British crown. It was a gesture of respect, or perhaps appropriation, depending on one's perspective. But the most astonishing detail was invisible until light caught it at the correct angle. Each peacock eye contained the iridescent wing case of a beetle, blue-green and shimmering like gemstones. Guests at the Durbar ball mistook them for emeralds. The illusion was deliberate. Mary understood that fantasy mattered as much as fact in the theater of empire. The completed gown weighed nearly 40 pounds. The skirt measured 12 feet in circumference and was trimmed with white roses fashioned from silk and velvet. The bodice featured antique lace that had once belonged to Marie Antoinette, purchased at auction in Paris. Mary wore a diamond necklace that covered her throat completely, diamonds given to her by George on their wedding anniversary. Her tiara featured pearls tipping each of its high diamond points, a style that became known as the Curzon tiara. When she entered the ballroom at the state reception on January 1, 1903, witnesses reported that the crowd fell silent. She moved through the hall slowly, deliberately, the gold cloth catching candlelight from thousands of candles, the beetle wings flashing blue and green like living jewels, the peacock feathers rippling with each step. One observer wrote in his diary that she was the most magnificent sight at the most magnificent event the empire has ever staged. Mary had achieved what no American woman had achieved before. She had become, for one night at least, the symbolic queen of 300 million people. The Chicago merchant's daughter had outshone Maharanis, whose families had ruled for centuries. The triumph nearly killed her. The years in India had destroyed Mary's health systematically. The relentless social obligations, the punishing climate, the constant travel through a subcontinent lacking modern medicine, the pressure of representing Britain before populations that vastly outnumbered the British officials ruling them, all of it wore her down. She suffered from headaches that lasted for days. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. In 1904, she suffered a miscarriage that led to a severe infection. Doctors feared for her life. George sat by her bedside for 3 days, writing down everything she murmured between periods of unconsciousness, convinced he was recording her final words. She survived, but barely. The infection damaged her internally. She would never be strong again. George requested permission to return to England, citing his wife's health. The British government refused. They offered to extend his term as viceroy for another 5 years. George consulted Mary. She begged to go home, to rest, to recover. He accepted the extension anyway. His ambitions mattered more than her survival. Mary returned to India because George needed her. She resumed the punishing schedule of state dinners, receptions, and travel. In 1905, George finally resigned following a political dispute with Lord Kitchener over military control. The argument had become bitter and public. George lost. The cabinet sided with Kitchener. George Curzon, who had been Viceroy of India and expected to become Prime Minister, discovered that his political career had peaked. He was 46 years old. The Curzons sailed for England in November 1905. Mary was 35 and looked far older. The headaches that had plagued her since girlhood now came constantly. She could barely eat. She weighed less than 100 pounds. Friends who saw her were shocked. On July 18, 1906, Mary Curzon died at their London home, Carlton House Terrace. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. She was 36 years old. George was devastated. He spent 6 years building a memorial chapel at Kedleston Hall, the family estate in Derbyshire, commissioning a marble effigy of his wife from the sculptor Bertram McKennell. He instructed that the effigy should express the pathos of her premature death and my deepest emotion. The inscription he composed read, "Perfect in love and loveliness, beauty was the least of her rare gifts. God had endued with like graces her mind and soul. Throughout her life, she worked incessantly for others, and few were the sorrows and sufferings, individual or national, in which she did not take a generous share. She was mourned in 3 continents, and by none more than by the poor, to whom she was kind, and the stranger, to whom she was merciful. This church was raised to the glory of God and in loving and reverent memory of her by her sorrowing husband." He never fully recovered from her death. He remarried in 1917 to a wealthy widow, Grace Hines, but the marriage was loveless. He continued pursuing political power until his death in 1925, never achieving the position he believed he deserved. The peacock dress survived. It hangs today at Kedleston Hall, preserved behind climate-controlled glass. The beetle wings still shimmer after more than a century. The gold thread remains bright. Visitors stand before it and try to imagine the woman who wore it. The Chicago girl who became Vicereine of India, who gave everything she had to her husband's ambitions and an empire that consumed her and died before reaching middle age. Mary Leiter Curzon achieved the highest political rank of any American woman in the age of dollar princesses. She paid for it with her life. The gown remains as evidence of what she achieved and what it cost her. 9. The woman who repented and fought for freedom. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont had reinvented herself before. The cotton merchant's daughter from Alabama had become the queen of New York society. The divorced woman who should have disappeared into obscurity had survived and rebuilt. Now, in 1908, at 55 years old, she would transform once more into something no one expected. Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont died suddenly on June 10, 1908, while vacationing in France. He was 50 years old. Alva had married him in January 1896, barely 10 months after her scandalous divorce, from William Vanderbilt. Society had expected her to slink away in shame. Instead, she had married another millionaire. Oliver was the son of August Belmont, the banker and racing magnate, and moved into Belcourt Castle in Newport, Oliver's Gothic fantasy mansion, where horses were stabled on the ground floor and medieval armor filled every room. The marriage had been genuinely happy. Oliver adored her. He supported her ambitions, tolerated her rages, and gave her the freedom to be exactly who she was. His death left her wealthy, widowed, and searching for purpose. She found it in votes for women. The suffrage movement had existed in America for decades. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had launched the campaign in 1848 at Seneca Falls. By 1908, 60 years later, women in most states still could not vote, own property in their own names if married, control their own earnings, or serve on juries. Respectable women did not march in the streets demanding rights. They did not give speeches on soapboxes. They certainly did not challenge the fundamental structure of society that kept them dependent on fathers and husbands. Alva had spent her entire life mastering that structure. She had forced her way into Mrs. Astor's ballroom. She had sold her daughter to a duke. She had ruthlessly manipulated everyone around her to achieve the position she wanted. Now she proposed to tear the entire system down. First, conversion was sudden and total. Within months of Oliver's death, she had joined the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Within a year, she had founded her own organization, the Political Equality Association, designed to bring suffrage advocacy into every neighborhood of New York City. She opened her mansions for rallies and meetings. She funded newspapers and pamphlets. She marched at the head of parades down Fifth Avenue, the same street where she had once arrived in triumph at her costume ball. She was photographed carrying banners, speaking from platforms, and confronting politicians who opposed women's rights. The newspapers that had once covered her balls and dinners now covered her speeches and arrests. The transformation bewildered everyone who knew her. This was the woman who had strapped a steel brace to her daughter's spine to force perfect posture. The woman who had threatened to fake a heart attack to force Consuelo into marriage. Now she argued that women must be freed from male control, that marriage should be a partnership of equals, that daughters should choose their own destinies. Some saw hypocrisy. Alva saw evolution. She had played by society's rules and won everything those rules offered. She had also watched her daughter weep at the altar and spend a decade in misery at Blenheim. She had seen what happened when women had no choices, no legal rights, no escape from marriages that destroyed them. The system she had mastered was the same system that had crushed Consuelo. In 1909, she told a reporter, "I have been repenting ever since that wedding day." The confession was public, printed in newspapers across the country. She acknowledged what she had done. She did not ask for forgiveness. She simply stated that she had been wrong, that forcing Consuelo into that marriage was the greatest mistake of her life, and that she would spend the rest of her life fighting to ensure no mother could ever do the same thing again. Her methods had not changed, only her targets. She approached suffrage the same way she had approached conquering Mrs. Astor, with unlimited money, relentless determination, and absolute refusal to accept defeat. She rented an entire floor of a Fifth Avenue building for suffrage campaign headquarters. She commissioned a Chinese tea house at Marble House specifically for suffrage meetings, a building that still stands today. She befriended Emmeline Pankhurst and Christabel Pankhurst, leaders of the militant British suffragette movement, and brought their tactics to America. In 1912, she organized a massive suffrage parade through New York, with tens of thousands of women marching through streets lined with jeering men who threw rotten fruit, spat, and shouted obscenities. Alva led her division wearing a white dress and carrying a purple, white, and gold banner. Police offered minimal protection. Several women were assaulted. Alva kept marching. In 1913, she helped organize a suffrage march in Washington, D.C., timed to coincide with Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. The march drew national attention when a mob attacked the participants while police stood by and watched. The public outcry forced investigations and brought thousands of new supporters to the movement. In 1917, Alva was among the founders of the National Woman's Party, the more radical wing of the suffrage movement that believed in confrontation rather than negotiation. The NWP organized the first pickets ever staged outside the White House, with women standing silently outside the gates holding banners that asked, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" The pickets continued through the summer and fall. Police began arresting the women for obstructing traffic. Alva was arrested multiple times. She paid bail for hundreds of other women. When imprisoned suffragettes went on hunger strikes, Alva publicized their treatment and organized protests outside the prisons. Through it all, she maintained contact with Consuelo. The separation of 1906 had freed her daughter from daily life at Blenheim, but the marriage remained legally intact. Consuelo wanted freedom. The Duke wanted an annulment so he could convert to Catholicism and marry Gladys Deacon, who had been his mistress for years. Consuelo refused unless she could secure a financial settlement and custody protections for her sons. The negotiations dragged on for years. In 1926, the case finally came before a Catholic tribunal in England. Canon law permitted annulment only if the original marriage had been invalid from the beginning, typically because one party had been coerced. Investigators needed testimony about what had happened in 1895. Alva provided it. She appeared before the tribunal and stated plainly what she had never publicly admitted. "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I have always had absolute power over my daughter. When I issued an order, nobody discussed it. I therefore did not beg, but ordered her to marry the Duke." She described the threats, the manipulation, the fake illness that had broken Consuelo's resistance. She held nothing back. The words were a confession and an apology, delivered 31 years too late. They were also a legal instrument that gave Consuelo her freedom. The annulment was granted on August 19, 1926. Consuelo was no longer the Duchess of Marlborough. She was free to remarry. Mother and daughter reconciled. The relationship would never be warm. Too much damage had been done. But it softened into something approaching friendship. Consuelo married Jacques Balsan, a French aviator and industrialist, in 1921. They settled in France, dividing time between Paris and a chateau in the Loire Valley. Alva visited them there. They corresponded regularly. In her final years, Alva lived mostly in France herself, maintaining a villa on the Riviera. She continued funding suffrage organizations in America and supporting women's rights campaigns internationally until her death. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont died in Paris on January 26, 1933. She was 79 years old. The 19th Amendment, guaranteeing American women the right to vote, had passed in 1920. She had lived to see her cause triumph. At her funeral, the suffragettes she had funded and fought beside filled the church. They remembered not the society hostess who had forced her daughter into misery, but the woman who had spent her final decades demanding that women be treated as full citizens with rights equal to men. Her tombstone, by her own instruction, bore no mention of the Vanderbilts or the Belmonts. It identified her simply as a leader in the women's rights movement. The mother who had arranged everything had finally arranged her own redemption. Whether that redemption was deserved remains debatable. She had helped win the vote for millions of American women. She had also destroyed her own daughter's youth. Perhaps she understood that one did not erase the other. Perhaps she simply believed that fighting for other women's freedom was the only atonement available to her. The woman who had sold her daughter for a title spent her final years trying to ensure that no woman could ever be sold again. 10. The Virginia girl who made history in Parliament. Nancy Witcher Langhorne was not supposed to conquer anything. She was born on May 19, 1879, in Danville, Virginia, the 8th of 11 children in a family that had lost everything in the Civil War. Her father, Chiswell Dabney Langhorne, had been a Confederate officer. After the surrender at Appomattox, he struggled for years, working as a tobacco auctioneer and railroad contractor, slowly rebuilding the family fortune through deals that required equal parts charm and ruthlessness. By the time Nancy was a teenager, the Langhornes had money again, substantial money from railroad construction and tobacco trading. But they remained Southerners in a South still defined by defeat. Nancy was beautiful in the situ, particular way that Southern beauties were supposed to be. Delicate features, dark hair, flashing eyes. She was also sharp-tongued, quick-tempered, and utterly unmanageable. Her family despaired of her ever making a proper marriage. At 17, she eloped with Robert Gould Shaw II, a Boston socialite whose family had produced Civil War heroes, including the colonel who commanded the 1st African-American Regiment. The marriage was a catastrophe from the beginning. Shaw drank heavily. He was violent when drunk. Nancy fled back to Virginia with their infant son, Bobby, and obtained a divorce in 1903, a scandal that should have ended her prospects in respectable society forever. Divorced women were social outcasts. They did not remarry. They did not entertain. They lived quietly on the margins, dependent on family charity. Nancy had no intention of living that way. She sailed for England. Her sister Irene had married Charles Dana Gibson, the illustrator whose drawings of elegant American women had created the Gibson girl ideal. Nancy, with her delicate features, tiny waist, and enormous eyes, could have modeled for any of Gibson's illustrations. She arrived in London in 1905 and immediately attracted attention. The Prince of Wales, now King Edward VII, noticed her at a party. Hostesses competed to invite her. She had that peculiarly American quality that the British found simultaneously refreshing and unsettling. She said exactly what she thought. When bored by a conversation, she walked away. When asked a question she considered stupid, she said so. When men made assumptions about divorced American women, she corrected them sharply. At a hunting party in Leicestershire in 1906, she met Waldorf Astor. He was the son of William Waldorf Astor, an American millionaire who had renounced his citizenship and moved to England after failing to achieve the social prominence he craved in New York. William Waldorf was vindictive, paranoid, and consumed by a hatred of American democracy. He purchased the Observer newspaper to shape British public opinion. He purchased Cliveden, one of the great estates of England, overlooking the Thames in Buckinghamshire. And in 1916, he purchased a peerage, becoming Viscount Astor after donating enormous sums to wartime charities. His son, Waldorf, was everything his father was not: kind, principled, genuinely interested in social reform. He was also quiet and serious where Nancy was volcanic and vivid. He fell in love immediately. They married in 1906. Nancy became mistress of Cliveden, a palace that had hosted every important figure in British politics since the 18th century. The house had been rebuilt after a fire in 1849, emerging as a massive Italianate mansion with formal gardens, terraces, and views over the Thames that were calculated to inspire awe. Waldorf entered Parliament as Conservative member for Plymouth Sutton in 1910. He championed housing reform, public health initiatives, and temperance. Nancy supported his work, hosting political gatherings at Cliveden where cabinet ministers, intellectuals, and reformers gathered for weekends of conversation that shaped policy. The gatherings became known as the Cliveden Set, a network of influential people who shared certain assumptions about Britain's role in the world, the dangers of communism, and the necessity of avoiding another war with Germany. But Nancy wanted more than influence. She wanted power. When Waldorf's father died in 1919, Waldorf inherited the Viscounty and was forced to leave his seat in the House of Commons. Under British law, peers could not serve in the Commons. The constituency of Plymouth Sutton needed a new candidate. Nancy announced she would stand. No woman had ever sat in the British Parliament. The Representation of the People Act of 1918 had granted women over 30 the right to vote and the right to stand for office, but no woman had yet won a seat. Constance Markievicz had been elected in December 1918 as Sinn Féin member for Dublin St. Patrick's, but she refused to take her seat because Sinn Féin rejected British rule over Ireland. The first woman to actually sit in Parliament would be whoever won the next available election. That election came in November 1919 in Plymouth Sutton. Nancy campaigned as only Nancy could. She knocked on doors in working-class neighborhoods, bantering with housewives and dock workers in language that shocked her Conservative Party handlers. She had no prepared speeches. She simply talked, answered questions, and insulted anyone who interrupted her. When a heckler shouted that she was too rich to understand ordinary people, she replied, "I was poor once, and I found it overrated." When another demanded to know what she would do about drink, she announced she was a teetotaler who would support temperance laws, then added that she understood why men drank. "If I had a wife like some of you have, I'd probably drink too." The crowds laughed. Her opponents fumed. She was outrageous, improper, and utterly effective. On November 15, 1919, she won Plymouth Sutton with 14,495 votes, a majority of more than 5,000 over her Labour opponent. On December 1st, Nancy Astor took her seat in the House of Commons. She wore a simple black outfit with a white blouse, the same colors suffragettes had worn during their marches. The men who filled the chamber, all 615 of them, had no idea what to do with her. Neither did she entirely. But she sat down in the third row below the gangway on the government side, the first woman to do so in 700 years of parliamentary history, and refused to leave. She would remain in Parliament for 26 years, representing Plymouth Sutton until 1945. She championed women's rights, children's welfare, housing reform, and temperance. She was fearless, frequently outrageous, and impossible to ignore. Winston Churchill, who detested her politics, reportedly told her at a dinner party that if she were his wife, he would drink poison. She replied instantly, "Winston, if I were your wife, I would give it to you." The exchange became legendary, repeated in memoirs and biographies, though both participants later claimed it never happened exactly that way. The story persisted because it captured something true about both of them. Nancy was not intimidated by anyone. The Virginia girl who had fled a violent first marriage and sailed to England with nothing but her wit had become the first woman to sit in the most powerful legislative body in the world. She had not married her way into Parliament. She had won her seat through force of personality and relentless campaigning. She proved that women could compete in politics and win. That achievement mattered more than any policy she championed or any law she passed. She opened the door. Within a generation, dozens of women would follow her through it. 11. The great-grandmother nobody remembers. Frances Ellen Work wanted nothing to do with the British aristocracy. Her father had made that abundantly clear throughout her childhood. Frank Work was a Wall Street stockbroker who had made his fortune trading alongside Cornelius Vanderbilt, Daniel Drew, and Jay Gould during the chaotic years after the Civil War. He was ruthless, brilliant, and fiercely patriotic. He despised the practice of American heiresses marrying European aristocrats. He considered it a betrayal of everything America stood for: democracy versus aristocracy, merit versus inherited privilege, New World values versus Old World decay. When his daughter Frances announced her intention to marry James Burke Roche, heir to an Irish barony, Frank threatened to disinherit her completely. Frances married him anyway. She was 19 years old and believed herself in love. The wedding took place at Christ Church in New York on September 3, 1880. James was charming, handsome, and would one day become the third Baron Fermoy. He was also, as Frances would discover, rapidly a gambler and a serial adulterer who had pursued her primarily for access to her father's fortune. The marriage collapsed within a decade. James burned through Frances's allowance at gaming tables in London, Monte Carlo, and Baden-Baden. He kept mistresses openly, making no attempt to hide his infidelities. When Frances fled back to America with their twin sons, Morris and Francis, and their daughter Cynthia, she had nothing left but her pride and her father's grudging support. Frank Work imposed brutal conditions for his forgiveness. Frances must divorce Roche immediately. The children must be raised as Americans. They must renounce any claim to British titles. And they must never return to England. If any child violated these conditions, they would be disinherited completely. Frances agreed to everything. In 1891, she obtained her divorce on grounds of adultery, one of the few grounds that allowed women to divorce in that era. She settled back into New York society as a cautionary tale about the dangers of marrying foreign aristocrats. Then Frank Work died on March 16, 1911, at 81 years old. His will reiterated the conditions he had imposed in life. Any grandchild who returned to England, assumed a British title, or married a British subject would be immediately disinherited. Their share of the estate divided among siblings who remained faithful to American principles. The estate was substantial. Estimates ranged from $5 million to $15 million. For Frances's children, the choice was clear: remain American and wealthy, or embrace their aristocratic heritage and lose everything. Morris Burke Roche chose heritage. He had spent his childhood dreaming of the barony he had been forced to renounce. He was more Irish than American, more drawn to the old world than the new. His grandfather's money meant nothing compared to a title. Within months of Frank Work's death, Maurice sailed for England. He would never return to America. Maurice became the fourth Baron Fermoy in 1920, when his father James finally died. The title carried almost no money. The Irish estates generated minimal income, but it granted entry into British aristocratic society. Maurice settled in Norfolk, where he became a friend of King George V through their shared passion for shooting. The king valued him as a witty companion who could be trusted not to gossip. Maurice married Ruth Sylvia Gill in 1931, an Anglo-Scottish heiress who was a trained concert pianist and society beauty. Ruth became a lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, a position that gave the Fermoys access to the inner circles of the royal family. Together, Morris and Ruth had 3 children. The youngest was a girl they named Frances Ruth Burke Roche, born on January 20th, 1936. She was named after the grandmother who had fled England 45 years earlier. Young Frances Fermoy grew up in the shadow of Sandringham, the royal estate in Norfolk that King George VI used as his primary country residence. Her parents moved in the highest circles of British society. Her mother Ruth was a constant presence at royal events, trusted by the Queen Mother as a confidant and companion. Frances herself played with the young princesses Elizabeth and Margaret during visits. In 1954, at 18 years old, Frances married Edward John Spencer, Viscount Althorp, heir to the 7th Earl Spencer. The wedding took place at Westminster Abbey, with Queen Elizabeth II and the Queen Mother in attendance. It was considered one of the great society weddings of the decade. The Spencers were one of the oldest aristocratic families in England, with connections to the royal family stretching back centuries. The marriage produced 5 children. The fourth, born on July 1, 1961, was a girl they named Diana Frances Spencer. Diana grew up at Park House on the Sandringham estate, literally next door to royalty. Her grandmother Ruth, the former lady-in-waiting, remained close to the Queen Mother and ensured that Diana and her siblings moved in royal circles from childhood. When Diana's grandfather Maurice died in 1955, her father inherited the earldom, becoming the 8th Earl Spencer. Diana became Lady Diana Spencer, a courtesy title that marked her as aristocracy. When she was 16, she met Charles, Prince of Wales, at a shooting party. He was dating her older sister Sarah at the time. Diana was too young to interest him, but the connection had been made. The Spencer family was respectable, well-connected, and acceptable to the royal family in ways that many wealthier families were not. In 1980, when Charles was 32 and under increasing pressure to marry and produce an heir, he renewed his acquaintance with Diana. She was 19, working as a kindergarten assistant in London, living in an apartment her parents had purchased for her. They courted for 6 months, mostly in private. Charles proposed on February 6, 1981. Diana accepted immediately. The wedding took place on July 29, 1981, at St. Paul's Cathedral, watched by a global television audience estimated at 750 million people. Diana wore a gown with a 25-foot train designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel. She became Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales, the most famous woman in the world, overnight. The marriage would end in disaster, separation, and divorce, followed by Diana's death in a Paris car crash in 1997. But none of that changes the fundamental fact. The great-granddaughter of Frances Work, the American heiress who had fled her disastrous marriage to an Irish baron, had become Princess of Wales. The bloodline that Frank Work had tried desperately to keep American had produced a future Queen of England. Diana's son William, born in 1982, will one day sit on the British throne. His blood carries genes from American stockbrokers and department store magnates who would have been barred from Mrs. Astor's ballroom. Frank Work's fortune, what remained of it after various descendants contested his will, eventually passed to people who had violated every condition he imposed. His great-great-grandson, William, Diana's son, is second in line to the throne. The American stockbroker who despised European aristocracy became the ancestor of kings. Frances Work herself never witnessed this outcome. She remarried in 1919, wedding Aurel Batogny, a French-Romanian horse breeder. She lived quietly in New York until her death on January 27, 1947, at 86 years old. By that point, her grandson Maurice was an established figure in British society, master of ceremonies at the king's coronation in 1937, trusted companion to the royal family. Her great-granddaughter Frances had married into the Spencer family. She never met Diana. She never knew that her flight from England and her father's furious conditions would become a footnote in the biography of the most celebrated princess of the 20th century. The dollar princess who escaped had produced a legacy she never intended. 12. The billion-dollar invasion and what it bought between 1870 and 1914, 454 American women married into the British aristocracy. They carried with them dowries totaling more than $1 billion. That figure, carefully tallied by contemporaries fascinated by the phenomenon, equals approximately $20 billion today. The marriages were not evenly distributed. Some women brought tens of thousands. Others brought millions. Mary Curzon's $200,000 dowry in 1895 was substantial, but not extraordinary. Consuelo Vanderbilt's $2.5 million in 1895 was exceptional, one of the largest settlements of the entire era. The money flowed into estates that desperately needed it, paying off mortgages, funding repairs, restoring crumbling palaces, and providing liquid capital that allowed aristocratic families to maintain their lifestyles. The Pewar women in exchange received titles, position, and entry into a society where birth still mattered more than wealth. The transaction reshaped both nations. American money saved the British aristocracy from extinction. Without those dowries, dozens of estates would have been sold, titles would have died out, families would have descended into poverty. Blenheim Palace would be a ruin today without Consuelo Vanderbilt's railroad stock. Longleat would have been demolished without American money. Chatsworth, Cliveden, and dozens of other great houses survived because American heiresses married their owners. British titles, in turn, gave American families the social legitimacy they craved. A daughter might be excluded from Mrs. Astor's ballroom when she was married later, but when she became the Viceroy of India, Mrs. Astor was forced to acknowledge her. A family might be considered vulgar newcomers when their fortune came from department stores, but when their daughter married a duke, they could no longer be ignored. The women caught between these forces learned to navigate a world where they were simultaneously the most valuable commodity and the least powerful player at the table. They were purchased, in effect, though the language of the transaction masked that reality. Marriage settlements spoke of trusts, annual incomes, and provisions for widowhood. They did not mention that what was being bought was a human being, a woman who would spend the rest of her life in a foreign country, often married to a man she barely knew, expected to produce heirs and maintain appearances regardless of her personal happiness. Some found genuine companionship in their marriages. Helena Zimmerman, who married the Duke of Manchester in 1900, enjoyed a partnership that lasted until her husband's death. Consuelo Vanderbilt eventually found love with Jacques Balsan after escaping her duke. Mary Curzon adored her husband, though he killed her through indifference to her health. Many others endured decades of unhappiness, trapped by social expectations and legal systems that offered women few exits. What united them all was transformation. These women did not simply accept the roles assigned to them. They bent those roles, broke them, or escaped them entirely when necessary. Mary Curzon became the most powerful American woman of her generation and used that power to champion women's health care across India. Nancy Astor won election to Parliament and spent 26 years demanding that men share power with women. Alva Belmont converted from society hostess to suffragette general, funding the movement that won American women the vote. Even Consuelo Vanderbilt, who had been given no choices as a girl, eventually chose her own path, divorcing her duke and marrying the man she loved. Jenny Churchill raised a prime minister and reinvented herself multiple times as widow, editor, playwright, and war nurse. Frances Work escaped her disastrous marriage and ensured her children were raised as Americans, even though her descendants eventually rejected everything her father stood for. They also left behind something unexpected, a legacy of transformation in British society itself. The American heiresses brought more than money. They brought informality, energy, and a refusal to accept that birth alone determined worth. They hosted parties where artists mingled with aristocrats. They supported causes that horrified their conservative in-laws. They questioned traditions that British women had accepted without debate for centuries. They raised children who would carry American values into the heart of the British establishment. Winston Churchill, grandson of a Brooklyn stockbroker's daughter, became the embodiment of British resistance to tyranny. His blood was half American. His mother's influence shaped his worldview, his politics, and his understanding that democracies must defend freedom regardless of cost. Prince William, who will one day be king, carries the bloodline of American heiresses through multiple branches of his family tree. Diana's American ancestry is well known, but through other lines, he descends from railroad fortunes, department store empires, and stockbrokers who built wealth through methods the old aristocracy considered vulgar. By the time the First World War shattered the old order in 1914, the British aristocracy had already begun changing from within. American money had saved estates. American ideas had infiltrated drawing rooms and dinner tables. American blood flowed through dozens of great families. The women who arrived as purchased brides had become agents of cultural transformation. Some paid terrible prices. Mary Curzon worked herself to death before 40. Consuelo Vanderbilt spent a decade weeping in a palace she hated. Others survived and thrived, building lives that their mothers could never have imagined. Jenny Churchill became a legend. Nancy Astor made history. Alva Belmont won redemption. Frances, Work's descendants, became royalty despite her father's fury. 13. The palaces they saved and the blood they left behind. Today, tourists walk through Blenheim Palace without understanding that American railroad money saved it from ruin. They admire the state rooms, the painted ceilings, the formal gardens, and the library where Winston Churchill was born. Few know that Consuelo Vanderbilt's $2.5 million in 1895 paid for the restoration that preserved everything they see. The ninth Duke used her money to repair roofs, restore ceilings, update plumbing, and install electrical systems. He used it to maintain the estate staff, fund agricultural improvements, and keep the palace operational during an era when dozens of similar houses were being demolished because their owners could not afford them. Blenheim survived because an American girl wept at her wedding and spent a decade in misery fulfilling obligations she never chose. The palace is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited by hundreds of thousands annually. Consuelo receives no mention in the official tours. The peacock dress hangs at Kettleston Hall behind climate-controlled glass. The beetle wings still shimmer. Visitors stand before it and photograph it, drawn by its beauty and the story of the Durbar where Mary Curzon wore it. Few understand that the woman who commissioned it worked herself to death in service to an empire that consumed her. The dress is magnificent. It is also evidence of what was demanded of women who married into power. Mary gave everything, her health, her youth, her life, to support her husband's ambitions and Britain's rule over 300 million people. She died at 36. The dress remains, preserved forever, a testament to what she achieved and what it cost her. Cliveden still overlooks the Thames, though it is now a luxury hotel rather than a private residence. The formal gardens where Nancy Astor entertained cabinet ministers and intellectuals remain immaculate. The house hosts weddings, conferences, and tourists who want to experience aristocratic life for a weekend. Nancy's political career, her groundbreaking election to Parliament, her decades of service to Plymouth, all of it has been overshadowed by conspiracy theories about the Cliveden set and its supposed sympathy for Nazi Germany in the 1930s. The accusations were largely unfounded, but they stuck. Nancy's actual achievements, first woman in Parliament, champion of children's welfare and housing reform, are forgotten by everyone except historians. Marble House in Newport stands as Alva Vanderbilt Belmont's most visible legacy. The mansion cost $11 million to build in 1892, equivalent to roughly $330 million today. It is now a museum operated by the Preservation Society of Newport County. The Chinese tea house she commissioned for suffrage meetings still stands on the grounds. Inside the main house, exhibits discuss the suffrage movement and Alva's late-life conversion to women's rights activism. They discuss, less prominently, that she forced her daughter into a marriage that destroyed a decade of Consuelo's life. The mansion is beautiful. It is also evidence of how money and power were used to achieve social dominance, and how that dominance came at a cost paid by others. The people who visit Marble House come to see the gilded ballroom, the marble walls, the elaborate decorations. They do not come to contemplate the suffering of a girl who wept herself blind on her wedding day. The bloodlines remain. That is the most enduring legacy of the Dollar Princess invasion. Prince William, who will one day be King William V, carries American DNA through multiple lines. His mother Diana descended from Francis Work through the Fermoy and Spencer families. Through other branches, his ancestry includes American fortunes from railroads, banking, and industry. When he becomes king, American genes will sit on the British throne for the first time in history. The irony would have horrified the aristocrats who reluctantly accepted American money in the 1890s. They believed they were selling nothing important. Daughters married foreigners all the time. They believed American blood would be diluted within a generation, absorbed into British stock, and forgotten. They were wrong. The American heiresses proved more resilient than anyone expected. Their children inherited their mother's energy, ambition, and refusal to accept limits. Those children married into more aristocratic families, spreading American blood through the entire British upper class. Today, it is nearly impossible to find a titled British family that does not have American ancestry somewhere in its tree. The money is long gone. The fortunes that seemed inexhaustible in 1895 were consumed by 2 world wars, death duties, taxation, and inflation. The Vanderbilt fortune, worth $100 million in 1877, was divided among descendants until individual shares became modest rather than world-changing. The lighter fortune vanished even faster. Mary's father Levi died in 1904, worth approximately $10 million. Adjusted for inflation, that equals roughly $300 million today. His children and grandchildren spent it. The family name disappeared from lists of America's wealthiest within a generation. The Astor fortune lasted longer because William Waldorf Astor invested in British property rather than American stocks. But even that fortune eventually declined as death duties stripped away capital with each generation. Only the titles remain. Consuelo's son, John, became the 10th Duke of Marlborough. His son became the 11th. The current Duke, the 12th, is Charles James Spencer Churchill, born in 1955. He still lives at Blenheim, though parts of the palace are open to tourists to fund maintenance. The house costs millions of pounds annually to operate. Without tourism revenue, it would be unsustainable. The American railroad money that saved it in 1895 is long gone. 14. What they actually bought and what they could never purchase. The Dollar Princesses bought titles, palaces, and entry into a society where birth had always mattered more than wealth. What they could not buy was acceptance. The British aristocracy tolerated them, benefited from their money, and married them to salvage estates. But they never fully accepted them. The criticism was relentless. American women dressed too elaborately. They wore too many jewels. They spoke too loudly. They laughed at inappropriate moments. They treated servants with excessive familiarity. They did not understand precedence. They were vulgar, ostentatious, and exhausting. British matrons complained that they dominated conversations, expressed opinions on subjects they did not understand, and refused to defer to their betters. The complaints masked a deeper anxiety. These American women threatened the entire system that kept the British aristocracy functioning. They proved that titles could be bought. They demonstrated that an American with enough money could become a duchess, regardless of breeding, regardless of education, regardless of everything that British society claimed determined worth. If marriage was simply a transaction, American money for British titles, then what remained of the aristocratic mystique? What separated a duke from a department store magnate except an accident of birth? The women themselves understood this perfectly. Consuelo Vanderbilt later wrote that she was purchased like property, that her wishes were irrelevant, that she was a commodity in a transaction between her mother and a duke who needed capital. Mary Curzon understood that her father's money had secured her marriage to George Curzon, though she loved him regardless. Jenny Jerome knew that Leonard's fortune had made her acceptable to the Marlborough family, though they despised her anyway. Alva Vanderbilt orchestrated her daughter's sale with the efficiency of a stockbroker executing a trade. Nancy Astor was an exception. She married Waldorf because they fell in love. But even she understood that her position as mistress of Cliveden depended on Waldorf's inherited wealth and title. None of them could escape the fundamental reality. They were valuable because they brought money. What money could not purchase was respect. The British aristocracy took the dollars and sneered at the women who brought them. They accepted American money to repair roofs, pay debts, and maintain estates while simultaneously mocking American manners, accents, and values. The hypocrisy was breathtaking and completely invisible to the people practicing it. They genuinely believed that they were superior by birth, that their titles meant something beyond economic value, that breeding mattered in ways that money could never match. When forced to choose between pride and solvency, they chose solvency, while pretending they had maintained their pride. The American women saw through this immediately. Consuelo understood that her duke had sold himself as surely as she had been sold. Mary Curzon recognized that George's political ambitions required her father's money to fund his career. Jenny Jerome knew that Randolph's family tolerated her only because Leonard's settlement paid their bills. The women were not naive. They understood exactly what they had purchased and what had been purchased from them. The tragedy was not that they failed to buy acceptance. The tragedy was that so many of them wanted it anyway. They wanted to belong. They wanted to be more than tolerated. They wanted British society to see them as equals, as worthy, as legitimate members of the aristocracy they had married into. Some achieved this. Jenny Churchill became genuinely beloved by the Marlborough house set and the king himself. Nancy Astor won respect through her political career and her fearless advocacy for causes she believed in. Others never achieved it. Consuelo remained an outsider at Blenheim, tolerated by her husband's family, but never truly accepted. Mary Curzon was respected as vicereine, but always seen as American, always slightly foreign, always not quite one of them. The limits of wealth were exposed most clearly in their children's lives. The sons and daughters of dollar princesses inherited their mother's money and their father's titles. They were fully British by law, raised in Britain, educated at British schools. But they also inherited their mother's American qualities, directness, energy, and a certain democratic instinct that made them uncomfortable with rigid hierarchies. Winston Churchill embodied this perfectly. He was the grandson of a Brooklyn stockbroker's daughter and the son of a duke's son. He carried both bloodlines equally. His politics reflected both. Belief in aristocratic leadership combined with faith in democratic values. His understanding of America came from his mother, who never let him forget that half his heritage was American. That understanding proved crucial in 1940 when he forged the alliance that saved Britain. 15. The end of an era and the legacy that endures. The Dollar Princess era ended with the First World War. After 1914, the flow of American heiresses to Europe slowed dramatically and then stopped. The war changed everything. Britain lost an entire generation of young men. The survivors returned to a country that could never be the same. Death duties, imposed at punitive rates to pay for the war, stripped estates of capital with each passing generation. Income taxes rose to levels that made maintaining country houses nearly impossible. Aristocrats who had never worked for money found themselves forced to sell estates, paintings, furniture, anything valuable. The great houses began falling. Some were demolished, others became schools, hospitals, or hotels. The aristocracy that had ruled Britain for centuries entered terminal decline. The marriages that had sustained them, American money for British titles, no longer made sense. American families had their own problems. The income tax, introduced in 1913, reduced the massive fortunes that had funded the invasion. The stock market crash of 1929 destroyed many of the remaining fortunes completely. By 1930, American heiresses no longer needed British titles to achieve social legitimacy. American society had changed. Mrs. Astor was dead. The 400 had dissolved. New York society accepted new money because old money had largely disappeared. The economic incentive that drove the Dollar Princess invasion, social legitimacy through aristocratic marriage, had vanished. The women who had made those marriages aged into relics of a vanished world. Consuelo Vanderbilt lived until 1964, dividing her time between France and America, writing her memoirs, attending charity events, and watching her sons manage Blenheim. She never expressed regret about leaving the Duke. She never expressed happiness about the years she spent as Duchess. She simply stated facts. She had been sold, she had endured, she had escaped, and she had built a life she chose for herself. Jenny Churchill died in 1921, decades before her son became Prime Minister and led Britain through its greatest crisis. She never witnessed his finest hour, but she shaped the man who would rise to meet it. Alva Belmont died in 1933, having transformed from society hostess to suffragette warrior. The 19th Amendment, which she helped win, had passed 13 years earlier. She lived to see her cause triumph. Nancy Astor served in Parliament until 1945, when she declined to stand for re-election at age 66. She lived until 1964, long enough to see women fully integrated into British political life, though still vastly underrepresented. Mary Curzon died in 1906, long before the empire she served began its collapse. Perhaps that was merciful. Watching India gain independence in 1947 would have devastated her. Their children and grandchildren inherited complicated legacies. They were aristocrats by birth, Americans by blood, and citizens of a world that no longer valued the things their parents had purchased. The titles remained, but they meant less with each generation. The houses mostly survived, but only as museums, hotels, or institutional properties. The money vanished, consumed by taxes, inflation, and the costs of maintaining properties designed for a way of life that no longer existed. What endured was blood. The American genes that entered the British aristocracy in the late 19th century spread through the entire upper class within 3 generations. Today, nearly every titled British family has American ancestry. The invasion succeeded beyond what anyone expected. The women who arrived as outsiders became insiders. Their children married more aristocrats. Their grandchildren married into the royal family itself. When Prince William becomes king, American blood will sit on the British throne. Diana's ancestry traces directly to Francis Work and the Fermoy barony. Through other lines, William descends from multiple American fortunes that funded the dollar princess invasion. The stockbrokers, railroad barons, and department store founders who built those fortunes would have been barred from the finest drawing rooms in New York. Their descendants will rule Britain. The irony is profound. The American heiresses came to Britain seeking what they could not achieve at home: social legitimacy, titles, acceptance by a society that valued birth over wealth. They succeeded partially, paying enormous personal costs for limited acceptance. But their long-term impact exceeded anything they intended. They did not just marry into the aristocracy, they transformed it. Their American energy, informality, and refusal to accept rigid hierarchies spread through British upper-class culture like a virus, weakening the very structures that had attracted them. By the time their grandchildren inherited titles and estates, the aristocracy had become something different, less rigid, more meritocratic, more willing to accept that talent and work mattered more than birth. That transformation was not inevitable. It happened because American women refused to simply accept the roles assigned to them. They pushed, they argued, they broke rules, and they raised children who questioned assumptions their British fathers had never examined. Conclusion: the forgotten women who changed two nations. The dollar princesses have been largely forgotten. Their marriages are footnotes in family histories. Their contributions are minimized or ignored. Blenheim Palace does not advertise that Consuelo Vanderbilt's money saved it. Kedleston Hall displays Mary Curzon's peacock dress without adequately explaining what she sacrificed to wear it. Cliveden markets itself as a luxury hotel without mentioning Nancy Astor's groundbreaking political career. Marble House tells Alva Belmont's story, but focuses on the architecture rather than the woman who used it as a weapon. The mansions remain. The women who built, restored, or inhabited them have faded into obscurity. This erasure is not accidental. It reflects the same forces that made their lives difficult in the first place. Women's contributions to history are systematically undervalued. Women who married for money are dismissed as gold diggers. Women who exercised power are remembered as manipulators. Women who fought for rights are caricatured as shrews. The dollar princesses suffered all of these judgments. They were mocked as husband hunters. They were criticized as vulgar. They were dismissed as unimportant despite the fact that their money saved estates, their children shaped politics, and their blood runs through the British royal family today. They were more important than the men they married, but history remembers the men and forgets the women. This documentary has attempted to correct that erasure by telling their complete stories, not the sanitized versions found in costume dramas, but the economic reality beneath the romance. These women were bought and sold in a market where titles were for sale, and American fortunes purchased what centuries of breeding could not: survival for a dying aristocracy. The transaction was efficient and profitable for everyone except, often, the women themselves. Some found happiness. Many found misery. All of them paid prices that the men in their lives never paid. They deserve to be remembered not as accessories to aristocratic history, but as agents of transformation who changed two nations through their courage, resilience, and refusal to accept the limits imposed on them. The invasion ended more than a century ago. The fortunes are spent. The estates have become museums. But the transformation those women set in motion continues. Their blood flows through British royalty, their energy reshaped aristocratic culture. Their fights for suffrage, for education, for women's health care, and for political representation laid groundwork that later generations built upon. They came for titles. They stayed to change history. That is their legacy. That is why their stories matter. That is why they should never be forgotten. If you found this investigation valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to support more deep dives into the economic and social forces that shaped history. Thank you for watching. Historians prefer tidy narratives. The triumphant Duchess, the tragic bride, the suffragette redeemed. But over 400 women made this crossing, and most of them left behind no memoirs, no hospitals bearing their names, no dramatic courtroom confessions. Their stories survive only in fragments. Consider Elizabeth Drexel. She married the 6th Earl of Winchelsea in 1914, bringing with her a banking fortune from Philadelphia. The wedding took place just weeks before the Great War erupted. By Christmas, her husband was commanding a regiment in France. She spent 4 years converting Haverholme Priory into a convalescent hospital for wounded soldiers, personally nursing men whose faces had been destroyed by mustard gas. The newspapers never mentioned her. When the Earl died in 1939, she returned to America and lived quietly until 1970, forgotten by everyone except the men whose bandages she had changed, or Marie Louise Hanbury. She became Lady Aldenham in 1897, married a man 40, years her senior, endured exactly the life everyone predicted, and died obscure. Her American fortune renovated Aldenham Park. The house still stands. Her name appears nowhere in the guidebooks. The pattern repeats endlessly. Daughters of Milwaukee brewers, Pittsburgh steel fortunes, San Francisco gold. They crossed the Atlantic carrying dowries measured in hundreds of thousands. They produced heirs. They hosted parties. They paid the bills. Most found neither glory nor catastrophe, just decades of quiet accommodation to a bargain their parents had made. Some rebelled late. Helena Zimmerman, Duchess of Manchester, after Consuelo Iznaga's son inherited the title, scandalized her family by divorcing her husband in 1931 and marrying a commoner. She died in obscurity in 1971, the last of the great dollar duchesses, outliving an entire world. The system itself vanished faster than anyone expected. The Great War destroyed the economic foundations that had made these marriages necessary. Death duties increased. Estates were sold. Aristocratic younger sons, who once would have sought American heiresses, found employment in business or government. American fathers discovered they could buy social acceptance in New York for far less than a British duke cost. By 1920, the invasion had ended. The last great transatlantic marriage was probably that of Barbara Hutton to Prince Alexis Mdivani in 1933, and even that was to a Georgian adventurer rather than a British peer. The age was over. What remains? Bloodlines, primarily. Trace the ancestry of British aristocrats today, and American surnames appear with startling frequency. The current Duke of Marlborough descends from Consuelo Vanderbilt. Dozens of other families carry the genetic inheritance of Baltimore, Boston, and Chicago. Prince William will ascend the throne carrying the DNA of Francis Work, who tried desperately to prevent exactly that outcome. The invasion succeeded in ways its architects never imagined. These women reshaped more than genealogy. They introduced informality into ritual-bound households. They questioned traditions no one had questioned for centuries. They supported causes that horrified their conservative in-laws. Most importantly, They demonstrated that birth was not destiny. You could marry into the oldest aristocracy in Europe and still remain, fundamentally, yourself. Some lost that battle, others won it, but the attempt mattered. The story we tell about them has shifted across generations. The Edwardians saw husband hunters and vulgar Americans. Mid-century biographers preferred victims and rebels. Modern historians emphasize agency, choice, complexity. All these narratives contain truth. None contain everything. What we can say with certainty is this. Between 1870 and 1914, over 400 American women crossed the Atlantic and married into the British aristocracy. They brought with them more than $1 billion. They saved estates, funded political careers, raised future prime ministers and princesses. Some found misery. Some found power. A few found love. Most found something more complicated than any of those simple endings. They were neither victims nor conquerors, neither fools nor heroes. They were women navigating systems designed by men, making the best bargains available, and occasionally breaking the rules entirely. The last of them died decades ago. The world they inhabited is as remote now as the Regency or the Renaissance, but their legacy endures in unexpected places. Every time a British aristocrat marries outside the established circle, every time someone questions whether birth should determine worth, every time a woman demands the right to choose her own destiny rather than accept the one assigned to her, the dollar princesses accomplished that. It may not be the legacy they intended, but it is the one that matters most.